What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about AI Limit, a sort of anime soulslite RPG that is essentially just an action game that borrows a few small elements from the Souls genre in a total package that I would say reminds me a lot of that game that released a few years back called Code Vein. But what are we doing here? So, this game just yesterday, from the time of this video, received a public demo over on Steam, which is where I am checking this out at, because previously, when this game was supposed to release all the way back in 2024, I believe, people had asked if I was going to take a look at it, and honestly I just didn't have the time then, but it has since been pushed back to March 27th, I believe, which brings me to one of two problems I think this game is ultimately going to encounter in terms of its launch in general. So March 27th sees the launch of both Atomfall as well as First Berserker Kazan. Of those two, Kazan is an extremely similar genre and everything that honestly looks a little bit more unique, and I thought that was worth mentioning because while what I've seen and played of this game looks decent to pretty good, I do just right out of the gate see this game struggling to gain much traction. But with that said, let's dive into it and actually talk about it. So AI Limit takes place in a future post-apocalyptic wasteland that saw some synthetic ecosystem collapse that ultimately caused the destruction of the entire planet, and in the time since then we have seen the rise of what they are calling bladers, or essentially what our main character is. Bladers look human, but are actually machines, kind of like a synth situation, but in particular they seem to be made of some special substance in this world simply known as mud. But unlike the mud in our world, this seems to have some sort of magical property here and is even used as like a sort of energy source almost for our main character here. Now this substance, mud, it also connects them to what are called branches, or effectively our save points, our bonfires, whatever you want to call them in this one. But basically the purpose of ourselves, the machines here, is to investigate the town of Havenswell, or what's left of it, I suppose, in search of the truth behind what happened previously and maybe even how to fix it. Now, in order to do that, we're going to be moving right along a relatively standard Souls-like journey, as I mentioned. So, a fair few parts of this game are extremely familiar if you've ever played anything even close to it in genre. You've got your basic attack, your special attack, your charged heavy, a whole host of different weapons like great swords, regular swords, daggers, the usual stuff. But we also have a few semi-unique things as well via our actual character and their frame, their spells and abilities they get on top of their nucleus. So when we start defeating bosses, towards the end of the demo really, you'll pick up a nucleus. The nucleus is your sort of core, as you would imagine, and it determines both how much experience you gain from killing enemies percentage-wise, but also how much you lose upon death. So unlike typical Souls games, you don't actually lose a set amount of experience or even all of it when you die. Rather, based on the nucleus you have equipped, you lose a percentage, and that percentage is permanently gone. There is no picking it back up. It just sort of flies out the window on you. So a sort of middle ground between there being no detriment at all versus potentially losing everything you've grinded for up to that point. So something to know for sure. Now that said, we also don't have a stamina bar at all. It's really just however much you are capable of dodging and attacking on your own. Though I will say the sort of AI tracking, especially on the enemies, is maybe a little over the top, but that tends to be a case with a lot of these types of games, so not necessarily the end of the world. And then to top it off, each of the weapons you equip has a special move associated with it, in addition to being enhanced at our sort of bonfire, or branches as they are known. Now here we can upgrade our character in the usual fashion, leveling up individual stats, which also increases defenses as a base, and each stat controls a bunch of secondary stats that you can see on the side, and your weapons as well scale off of one of these stats typically, so you want to focus on weapons that make the most of the stats you are actually increasing, as you would expect. All pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. Now on a slightly more interesting note, the game itself is very smooth to play, which is hard to I would say quantify in words, but as you can hopefully see on screen to some degree, actually moving around is a very fluid system. It feels great to move through the world, and there's typically a fair bit of feedback. But when you're actually in combat, I will say that it can be difficult to know exactly what an enemy's attack is going to look like. For instance, this boss uses these giant sweeping AoEs, and I did notice that even if you properly dodged out of them, there is a chance that that dodge will land you still within range of the attack, and you wind up getting hit by the tail end of it anyway, as an example. So I do think there's things like timings that could stand to be tightened up a little bit between now and the ultimate release, but by and large, it's a very smooth feeling gameplay system, which is exactly what you want for this kind of game. And while the demo was relatively limited, there seems to be a decent variety in how you can set this character up, with weapons, weapon abilities, various spells and things. But all of that is ignoring perhaps the most important mechanic, which is this sort of energy bar here. While you don't have a stamina bar, you do have this staged energy bar. Now, as you make basic attacks against an enemy, this will fill up, and as you get hit, it will decrease. This is important because what stage this bar is in determines both how much damage you take, but also what you're capable of doing, because a lot of your special abilities actually require energy from this bar. And when it is completely filled, you actually get a bonus to your damage. So ideally, you want to activate abilities when it's full so you can get that bonus to damage while at the same time weaving in your normal attacks to keep it built up. But managing that bar will ultimately be pretty key to the actual combat system here, and I would say that's sort of their replacement for their normal stamina bar, while at the same time kind of serving as a sort of pseudo cooldown for your individual abilities, because if you don't have the energy to cast or use them, you obviously can't do so, and thus you have to weave in some basic attacks to build that charge back up. Now, unfortunately, the demo was relatively limited in terms of places we could explore, and I think that's important because, level design and how it feels to move about these spaces and how that looks visually tends to be a big part of these games. And while the level that we start in does have some really cool set pieces, like this giant robot thing attacking you from a hallway that you can then later kill and open up a side passage through, one's pretty neat. But that kind of brings me to my other point. In order for this game to stand out in a sea of games like this that release these days, you ultimately have to, I would say, wow people with bosses, have really good combat, and an interesting narrative, because it is just straight up a genre that is hard to stand out in. And while what I played in this demo seemed promising, it's pretty much impossible to say how that will hold up over the entire course of the title when it ultimately releases in March. And so far, I remain unconvinced. This mostly just seems okay, and outside of the art style, I'm not really seeing any unique reasons to play this one specifically over, other games in this genre unless you're just like a real diehard about it, which might very well be the case. Now, combine that with the fact that there are 2 other games releasing on its release date that I also want to review, and you've got a game that I'm probably not going to get around to taking a look at unless I find a sudden opening in my schedule or something. But nonetheless, I'll keep an eye on it and see if it happens to surprise me at all. But for right now, I think that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.